now it's time for our second guest, and our second guest is Berent from Northeastern University with a talk entitled "How We Reason About Innateness." Iris did her master in cognitive psychology and music theory at University of Pittsburgh, where she also did her PhD in cognitive science. She became a professor at Northeastern in 2008, and her work focuses on abstract universal constraints on phonology and the way people reason about innate aspects of our cognition and emotions. And she's also an author of 2 books, and one of them, The Blind Storyteller, concerns the topic that we are interested in today, so the way people reason about innateness. So Iris, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much for inviting me. This is a lot of fun. I really enjoyed it, and great conference. So I think Richard basically summarized my talk, so I'm going to just spell it out. So in this talk, I'm looking at lay people's intuitions about innateness as opposed to how innateness ought to be examined by science. And although I will touch on the relevance of this at the end of my talk. So people, of course, have always been concerned about questions of innateness. And when they do so, their concerns typically are not about sensory and motor capacities. So people would not debate about why we can't fly. Few will assume that that people would assume that this capacity is innate in us. So the debate instead is about the origin of our knowledge and beliefs. At stake is whether there are certain beliefs that we are bound to hold simply because we are born humans, and that includes propositional attitudes. So are we born knowing that objects are cohesive, that 1 + 1 is 2? Are we also innately predisposed to entertain concepts such as object and number? So in what follows, I'm just going to collectively refer to those as ideas or also as epistemic states. And in psychology, of course, we know that there are 2 contenders, right? One position says that ideas arise from learning. Another says that some ideas at least are innate. And of course, these positions have the roots in philosophy. But I'm a humble cognitive scientist, and in cognitive science, we are told that a priori both positions are plausible. We have sophisticated tools to explore them, so all we need to do is roll up our sleeves, go to the lab, and we shall find out, right? Well, turns out, as we see here today, the few questions in science are as controversial as the notion of innateness, and despite all our technology, it shows no signs of abating. But it turns out that lay people also have some pretty strong feelings about this topic, and for that, the question is pretty much solved. They already know the answer. And for them, it's self-evident that ideas simply cannot be innate. And this is not only my contention. Actually, this conclusion has been arrived at by 2 different labs simultaneously, mine and Lisa Feigensson's lab. We both publish our conclusions at the same journal on the same issues, which is great because it shows that, these results converge. So the question then is whether people are in fact biased as charged. And when you consider this question, there is a challenge here, obviously, because if scientists cannot agree on what is innate, how can we charge people with a bias? So what I propose to do is follow 2 strategies. The first is to look at facts. So invite people to reason about specific experiments that have been conducted, and we know in the situations what people actually do, and with those facts in mind, we can see how people reason about those experiments, what predictions they make, and whether they are right. The second and more important question is what logic drives these predictions and whether this logic is sound. So these 2 questions basically will correspond to the 2 parts of the talk. And in the first part, we try to look at lay people's intuitions about innateness. So here we simply invited people to play scientists. We asked them, what do you think newborns know? So here we presented people with detailed experiments of published infant research along with the rationale and method, and asked people to predict what will infants do in these situations. The assumption being that if these capacities are innate, then they could, not necessarily, but they could emerge at birth. And now that we know what actually happens, we can see what lay people think against this backdrop. So to give you one example is a number cognition experiment by Izad and colleagues that has been in fact done with newborns. And this task examines whether newborn infants indeed do have a sense of numbers. So in these experiments, infants are presented with a certain number of sounds and a certain number of lights that are either congruent, like 4 sounds, 4 lights, or incongruent, 4 and 2. And we told people, listen, if infants have a notion of number, then scientists expect infants to look longer at the congruent condition. So with this in mind, tell us, what do you think will happen? Will they look longer, yes or no? Simple question. In the same way, we asked people about other cases, such as knowledge of language, whether newborn infants prefer syllables like blog to log, do they have rudimentary morality, do they prefer helpers to hinderers? All of those are arguably examples of epistemic states, and we know what happens. We know from science that each of these capacities are available to infants. The first 2 are actually demonstrable in newborns. But when we ask people to predict, they're saying, no way, there's no way infants know about any of this stuff. Critically, people do not just deny innateness across the board. When you ask them about emotions, for instance, so would a newborn prefer happy faces to an angry one? They tell you, sure. And here, actually, the science tells you no, at least as far as what we know about newborn infants at the moment. So it looks like our empiricist intuitions are nuanced. People are all too happy accepting that emotions are innate. This conclusion, in fact, is supported by another paper from my lab that looks at emotions specifically. But when we ask people to reason about epistemic states, they are saying they are not possibly innate. Same conclusions arise also when you examine another probe of innateness, a desert island situation. So here we invite people to consider what happens if you had a group of infants, you raise them as a group without inputs from adults so that they have no opportunity to observe certain traits for others, but otherwise they are fully cared for. Which of the following traits will emerge in those infants? Again, the assumption is if those traits are innate, then they ought to emerge spontaneously. And the traits are all traits that have been documented by ethnographies across cultures. So here I should qualify my question and note that we don't know for sure whether they're innate or not. This is a controversial question, but we can ask which intuitions people have about these questions. So we contrasted among our 80 traits, half were epistemic states like having a concept of person or keeping track of time, and the others were non-epistemic. They included emotions like love and fear, and motor capacities such as squatting down and lifting. And when we ask people, are these things innate? Will they emerge spontaneously on a 1 to 5 scale? What they told us is that epistemic states are significantly less likely to emerge spontaneously than non-epistemic states. The difference is relative, right? They did not say here that epistemic states are not innate, but less so than non-epistemic states. So to try to clarify what people actually think, we decided to kind of put them against the wall, so to speak, and give them a yes-no choice. Tell us, innate or not, and explain what this means. And here the result is much clearer. People say for epistemic states, no, they're not innate. So their forced choice rating are significantly below chance. For non-epistemic states, they are significantly above chance. And of course, the difference is significant. So once again, Our intuitions are nuanced. People deny innate ideas, but they are all too happy to accept that emotions, sensations, and actions are innate. And the question is why, right? Why are we blind to human nature? Why do we have these particular intuitions? And there are many existing explanations for this, which I will not discuss here, not because I think they are wrong, but rather because I believe that in and of themselves, they're insufficient to explain what's going on here. So in the interest of time, I'm going to jump right to the explanation that I think can do so. And my contention basically is that our blindness to human nature arises from the very workings of the human mind. And there are two suspects here, so to speak. Each of them is quite familiar, and each of them has been widely investigated. These are intuitive dualism and essentialism. What has not been previously noticed, however, is that these two intuitive principles stand in mutual conflict to each other, and when they combine, they collide to form a perfect cognitive storm. So let's see how the storm arises. Intuitive dualism is the beliefs that minds are disembodied, they are distinct from the material body, they are made of some special substance. And since ideas are considered part of the mind, they are not in the body. The second suspect in crime is essentialism. Now, essentialism has been invoked for so many functions, social, biological, that it's very difficult to tell what it really means. So here I'm going to narrowly focus on how people reason about biological essentialism. And here the picture is pretty clear. I'm going to make two hypotheses. The first is widely known, and that is the notion that essentialism, that paressentialism, lay people believe that living things inherit some immutable essence from their biological parents. This is uncontroversial. The second assumption is less familiar, but I think it is actually supported by the existing evidence. And that is the assumption that that essence is embodied. This is in line with previous results that suggest that the essence is viewed inside the organism. It is in fact in the center of the organism. Sometimes it must correspond to a particular type of right substance, such as blood. Sometimes children actually tell you that it's a tiny piece of matter. So they tell you that this doggy is brown like its mother because it got from its mother this tiny little piece of matter, which explains why it's brown. And further support for this, the notion that essence is embodied, comes from research from my lab that shows that when we tell people that a given trait is in the body, say it shows up in the brain, then people jump to the conclusion that that trait is innate, and in fact they tell you that it's more likely to define one's essence. So now we can see how the storm arises, right? Because essentialism, tells you that what's innate in us must be in our body. But dualism tells you that ideas ain't there, right? They are somewhere else. They are in the mind. So it follows that ideas cannot be innate. They are simply in the wrong place for being innate. And that is obviously a very dubious logic to apply. And if people indeed apply this logic, then they're highly suspect of bias. So do people in fact follow this logic? So in what follows, I'm going to summarize some results that show that indeed they do. I'm not going to go over all these experiments. You're welcome to consult the paper that's on my website. So the first items on our agenda is to show that people indeed believe that ideas are disembodied as required per dualism. To do so, what we do, I'm going to actually present today a couple of ways of looking at embodiment, several probes of embodiment, and the first one is using the replication rationale. So here we invite people to suppose it was going to be possible to create a replica of a human body. The replica, people are told, will preserve every aspect of the human body and brain. And the question is, what aspect of the donor will transfer to the replica? The rationale being that if a trait is considered embodied, then once you replicate the body, that trait ought to transfer to the replica as well. So the transfer of the trait is thus a gauge of embodiment as it is perceived. And the question is, do people think that epistemic traits are less embodied, less likely to replicate? We presented them with the 80 traits I described earlier, 40 epistemic, 40 non-epistemic. And when we asked them, what they said is, epistemic traits are significantly less likely to transfer to the replica. To figure out whether this has anything to do with them being ideas, we asked another group of individuals to rate those ideas, to rate those traits as ideas versus processes, and then we correlated the proportion of ideas scores with the replication rating. And what we found is a strong negative correlation, meaning the more likely you are to think of a trait as an idea, the less likely you are to consider it as one that is likely to replicate and hence as embodied. In other experiments, we use another probe of embodiment, and here we invited people to reason about brain imaging scenarios. So once again, people are invited to play a scientist, and they are told, suppose a scientist got this wonderful grant to look at the brain imaging, except for scientists are not so sure whether all traits are going to be in the brain, and perhaps some traits are not, or cannot be easily localized. If that's the case, then the experiment is going to fail. So please advise the scientists and tell them which traits are good candidates for imaging. Our assumption is if a trait is perceived as embodied, then it should be a good candidate for imaging, and that is an gauge of its embodiment. The question is, do people think that embodied traits are disembodied as a poor candidate for imaging? Indeed, they do. They rated epistemic traits as less likely to show up in the brain, and again, strong negative correlation with their status as ideas. The more you think about a trait as idea, the less likely you are to believe that those traits, in fact, will be embodied in the brain. Now, you might come back at me and rightly say that the reason why epistemic traits are rated lower on those tasks may arise from reasons that have nothing to do with their embodied status. Maybe they are abstract, maybe they are confusing, who knows? So to address this concern, what we want to do is look at the second side of the dissociation, right? The complementary dissociation between epistemic and non-epistemic states. Rather than asking, do these traits show up in the body in some form? What we can ask next is, do these traits show up when the body is no longer relevant in the afterlife, right? So here, what we did is invited people to reason about what happens in the afterlife. We told them that, of course, nobody knows what happens, but for the purpose of this experiment, tell us what you think. So when people die, let's assume that some traits do continue to exist in some capacity, and your trait is to tell us which of the following traits is likely to persist. And if you're just confused by epistemic traits, then you should continue rating them lower, right? But if you believe that they are truly disembodied, the now epistemic trait should be a very good candidate to persist in the afterlife. We presented them with precisely the same traits in before, and now indeed the results reverse. Now it's epistemic traits that are considered a better candidate for emerging in the afterlife compared to, to non-epistemic traits, with a strong positive correlation between the status of a trait and ideas and its afterlife potential. So given this double dissociation, what these results suggest is that indeed ideas, epistemic traits, are likely perceived as disembodied. Our question then is, do people simultaneously also believe that innate traits must be embodied as suggested by essentialism? The logic is the following. Suppose you are an essentialist, and suppose I just told you that a trait is innate. If you believe that innate traits are embodied, then upon learning that a trait is innate, you have also learned something about its embodiment. So we expect that when people are told that a trait is innate, they should now be more convinced that the trait is embodied compared to when the very same trait is presented as learned. Okay? So with this in mind, we once again invited people to reason about the embodiment of a trait. Here we're looking at the replication scenario. We're looking at traits of infants this time. So if you replicated the body of an infant, which of its traits will transfer to the replica? Epistemic states, such as understanding that the object exists when occluded, or sensory and motor traits like preferring good smells or making a fist. But before they made this judgment about replication, we gave them with some information about the origins of the trait. And one group of participants were told these traits are innate, and we told them what this means. We actually used the word inborn. We told them they emerge typically in the course of development, and even when the individual has no opportunity to learn it from others. Other participants were told these traits are learned. And with this information, the question is, what do people think about embodiment? What we find is that people rated traits that were presented as innate as significantly more likely to be innate compared to ones that were presented as learned. The difference is small, but it is reliable. And in addition to that, we replicate the previous finding whereby epistemic traits are considered less likely to transfer to the replica as less embodied. Similar results happen when we ask people to reason about traits of animals or traits of aliens. Here, we presented people with actual description of what these traits are like because people do not necessarily know them. So, for example, for bird traits, we told them about the structure of the swamp sparrow song that follows the A-X-B rule. That is actually true. So this is an epistemic trait. Or we told them about the flight style of the zebra finch, defined this, that follows a particular set of frequencies and so forth. But before making judgment on that, we either told people all those traits are innate, or we told them that they are learned. And then we asked them, suppose we form the replica of this bird, how likely it is that the trait will transfer to the replica? Answer, people consider innate traits as significantly more embodied, as significantly more likely to transfer to the replica compared to when the very same trait was presented as learned. This is for bird traits, the same you get when you ask about traits of aliens. And in all cases, epistemic traits additionally are considered as disembodied. So I've shown that, in fact, per dualism, people consider ideas as disembodied. We've also seen that per essentialism, people do consider innate traits to be embodied. So now we have an explanation as to why people consider ideas as less likely to be innate. And in fact, other results from my lab show that there is a causal relationship between dualism and essentialism and innateness intuitions. These results are limited insofar that they come from Western culture, so we don't know what the source of the bias is, and we certainly don't know whether these ideas are in fact innate. But the results are significant in as much that they show that lay people are systematically and selectively biased in reasoning about ideas, and these biases are plausibly rooted in intuitive cognition. Implications to the scholar. If people are biased and scholars are people, then scholars are at dangers. We ought to proceed with caution. Inasmuch that our models of AI is made in our own image. Sometimes this is in fact an explicit goal. This was an explicit goal in the inception of connectionism, for instance, to model human cognition. In as much that we build our AI in our self-image and we view ourselves as innately devoid of any epistemic states, then AI is going to be subject to the same blank slate biases. And as Marcus and Debbie suggested, that can be a huge liability. So given these results, what do we scholars, what are we going to do about innateness? And the first question is, why are we really so obsessed about it? Why is it such an important question for us? Given the result I've presented here, if I'm going to be honest, I would have to say that it is very possible that in part, our obsession with innateness might well arise from our intuitive psychology, from intuitive essentialism and its conflict with dualism. And it's a painful conclusion to arrive at, given that I spent my entire career looking at this question. But I don't think that really means that we should abandon it. In fact, I think we shouldn't. First, the motives of why we're interested in a given scientific question is entirely irrelevant to whether or not we should pursue this question. And in fact, if we were to cancel every scientific discipline that is somehow motivated by intuitive psychology, then we are not going to be left with very much, because this will cancel biology and math and physics and so forth. So I don't think this is a profitable strategy. Certainly, we should not move to assume that if innateness is a difficult question, then it is all learned. Obviously, this doesn't follow logically, but this is a move that one sees over and over in the literature with absolutely no justification. So no, we should not abandon innateness, and what we should do instead is study it profitably by anchoring it in a psychological theory, for example, as a psychological primitive, as Richard Sammons suggested in his talk. But still, this leaves us as research in kind of a difficult situation, right? Because in a way, we are the victim of two conflicting rivalry cognitive systems, right? Our approach to the study of innateness ought to be scientific, governed by our rationality. But then it's very likely that at least some of our motives to be interested in the question in the first place come in part from intuitive psychology. And we know what essentialism is telling us, and we know that these little spells that it puts in our ears are actually all baloney and wrong. So what are we going to do about that? I think that in the spirit of good old psychotherapy, what I suggest is look at these demons in the eye, acknowledge them so you don't follow them, and then just proceed with your own thing, right? Proceed with the scientific approach, as we must. So given this, can the science of innateness ever feel right intuitively? Unlikely, right? Because the motivation for the study and the answers that we give come from entirely different systems. But I think it's okay. It's probably the best we can humanly do, and it's probably innate. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the talk. And now we have time for discussion. So again, you can ask your questions in the Q&A section. In the meantime, I have actually one, maybe in fact two correlated questions. You mentioned that actually the most of the data that you have is based on studying adults from Western culture, but are there any studies that might suggest that the similar way of reasoning about innateness can be present in other cultures as well? Or
no, great question, and certainly something that we want to do. So we don't know, as I mentioned, we don't know what other cultures would do. So we don't know whether the storm would arrive spontaneously. What we do know, however, is that the ingredients of the storm, the dualism and essentialism, are present cross-culturally. So we know that even members of mind opacity societies, those societies in which it's not polite to talk about one's mental states, still show evidence for dualism. Essentialism has been likewise documented across cultures. I should also note that another reason, so you might wonder, right, why should dualism be universal? And the answer is probably because it arises from the different core knowledge system that we use to reason about objects on the one hand, and agents, the theory of mind, on the other. This would explain why dualism might arise generally. Does it mean that the empiricist storm arises generally? We don't know. It doesn't follow logically, but I think that it's not unlikely.
I think Richard has a question.
Thanks, Iris. That was really interesting. So I found myself wondering about the following case. So if you're imagining that we're folk essentialists and folk dualists, what would you predict would happen about psychological capacities in your duplication studies? So rather than a particular idea, would you expect a baby who's duplicated to be a baby who could think? That's the case I was thinking about.
Great question. So I think here there's a reason why I use the term epistemic state as opposed to cognitive mechanism. I think that people potentially could accept the possibility that the mechanisms, think about it, say, as a container and what's in the container, right? That the container itself is innate probably is not going to offend people because, again, the container can be possibly viewed as embodied intuitively. But it's the notion of ideas per se that is probably going to be much harder for people to accept as innate. Now, people might have issues with the container being innate for other reasons. So the notion that intelligence, for instance, is innate might offend them for reasons that have to do with free will, for instance. But as far as dualism and essentialism are concerned, there may very well be this dissociation between the cognitive mechanisms, and the epistemic states that they hold. Did I answer the question?
I think so. So it seems though then you have a specific form of dualism in mind. So it's not going to be something like Descartes' dualism where minds as such are disembodied, or at least capable of being disembodied, non-physical entities, but rather it's going to be the contents of minds are non-physical or non-material. Is that the thought?
I don't know philosophy enough to tell you which of those Descartes actually hold. I'm actually very curious. Maybe you can tell me.
I thought minds were a mind was an immaterial, that is a sort of a non-physical entity. But but he's thinking about it as that's going to be, so he's a thinking thing, and that's a thing which has various capacities. So the capacity to think and so on. So the thing that's doing the thinking, that's something that is at least capable of being disembodied, and it's not a physical entity. Okay. The way you right, so you've got to. Sorry, just trying to get clear on the kind of dualism you have in mind. Okay, thank you.
Sure. But it's an empirical question, right? I don't know yet.
Sure. Thanks.
Actually, I have another question. So regarding the first part, when you talked about the research that you conducted, when you ask people about infants. So people assume that, for example, infants don't have ideas of they don't have innate concepts, but may also stem from the fact that people in general do not ascribe very strong cognitive abilities to infants. So, for example, if you would ask people if they find it plausible that infants can learn some, aspects of phonology in utero, for example, people would always also guess that it's not possible, but because the infant is not really cognitively capable of any learning.
Yeah, true. If you simply take the results that I presented at the first part at face value, they are open to tons of interpretation, right? It's the link, it's the logic, it's the faulty logic that is the primary, evidence here against the suspect. It's the fact that people reason about innateness by reasoning about embodiment. that is highly suspicious. And this is, I think, the critical point here. With respect to phonology, in fact, I got to this research program precisely because my research was about phonology, and the way linguists, some at least, look at phonology is as an abstract computational system. People fail to see that phonology could be partly innate precisely because they think it's all about talking. So, in fact, that exactly exemplifies the problem that we have here.
So also, like from your work in phonology, you also observe that people, in general, like lay people, but also scientists, intuitively assume that it's mostly learned. What's your impression?
That is definitely the burning question in phonology these days, so much so that, unfortunately, this it is no longer even debated as an empirical question. It is often assumed that because phonology has embodied correlates, therefore it is embodied. So yeah, I think we are not at a good place there.
Mm-hmm. I see. Great. Do we